they gave me a free hand to pick which particular topic I wanted to talk about, and my first choice was, they said Legends of Fort Henry. It would take a little longer than you probably want to sit here to go through all of them, simply because there were so many of them. Fort Henry, how do I want to say this? This area along the Ohio River from Fort Pitt down through the Kentucky settlements, to put it in the proper frame of reference, this was the Western theater of the American Revolution. Now technically, the headquarters of it was Fort Pitt, but all the really neat, interesting people headquartered here just kind of out of Fort Henry. I mean, when you think about it, you had Lewis Wetzel, Betty Zane, Sam McCullough, Sam Brady, all these folks. Again, another perhaps the area's first really famous, and maybe today most famous bad man, Sam Mason. Just show of hands, any of you folks ever heard of him? One more time, show of hands. Who's seen the movie How the West Was Won back in the 60s? I'm sure a lot of you have. That crusty old character played by Walter Brennan, where they were waylaying boats coming down the river, he was based on Sam Mason, just for what that's worth. He was kind of a loose interpretation of it, but that was the actual character he was based on. But anyway, a lot of really neat people headquartered out of there. And I guess what I wanted to talk about tonight, and again, I see a lot of women in the audience, maybe it's appropriate that we have a woman's story, or a women's story. And we'll talk specifically, what I wanted to talk about tonight was the Second Siege of Fort Henry. And to kind of set the stage for you a little bit, step back and look at what the actual conditions were. The war in the East, the Eastern theater of the American Revolution, things had come to a halt. They remember, when this is going to take place in 1782, September 1782. The previous October, Cornwallis had already surrendered at Yorktown. Okay, so what you had right now in the East, they weren't at war. There was no actual firing going on. But on the other hand, the negotiations were underway. But it was a rather tense peace. The British still occupied, I believe it was New York, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah. In the West here, the war continued on almost without pause. What makes matters worse is in the 1782 was kind of a very much of a watershed year too. It was a mild winter that year, typically, well, kind of like we're having right now, or like we had a few years ago. The temperatures weren't too bad. Consequently, what would happen, typically the way the Indians fought, the Indian raiding season would last from about the middle of March through maybe the middle of October. In fact, that's the term Indian summer that we use now actually came from that period. What happened typically at the first freeze, the Indians would return home to hunt their meat for their families for the winter and take advantage of the natural refrigeration. Sometimes when the weather would get warm, they would come back again to raid after the first freeze, and that's where the term Indian summer came from. That's how it entered our language. It comes from that period. But anyway, 1782 was a very mild winter. But again, the war in the West here continued on without a stop. In, I believe it was January of that year, there was an Indian raid up around the tip of the panhandle of West Virginia. A woman was taken, a woman and her child were taken, a man was taken from somewhere else. The man got away, but the woman and child weren't so lucky. They were found, the Indians had impaled them somewhere in Ohio, where the people who were following to rescue them would find them. And of course, all this inflamed the frontier. They gathered together a body of men, and in April that year, that's when the Janaden Massacre occurs. And of course, again, when you had this war in the frontier was different in two ways, in the sense that it was a lot of ways a no-quarter contest. Most of the way, both sides were just about ready to fight each other to extermination with the idea, whenever they made peace, it was just the idea both sides could take a pause till they went at it again. It wasn't like the war, it wasn't like Washington fighting Cornwallis or a British general against an American general. It was pretty much a no-quarter affair. And the other thing that differed, this wasn't groups of guys fighting each other, okay? This wasn't military units against A against B. When you fought here, you were standing there shoulder to shoulder next to your, maybe your brother-in-law, your uncle, your wife, your sister, whoever, your kids. It was, in this kind of war, everybody played, everybody's skin, everyone had skin in the game, to be sure. In that sense, again, the war in the West was very different. So by the time we get to June of that year, of course, we know that the Crawford expedition occurs. There's the Indian raiding on the frontier so bad, they decide that the only way that they can, the best defense is a good offense. They have a meeting at Fort Pitt, and of course, the regulars at Fort Pitt were in deplorable condition. They were on the verge of mutiny. And again, remember that these people were literally here on their own resources. The regulars there were in rags and starving. There was no way they could really give the frontier much assistance. The state of Virginia was bankrupt. Consequently, these people were very much left to their own devices. They formed a group that went under Crawford to try to raid the Indian villages up around the Sandusky area. And of course, we all know what happened. They caught Crawford up there. He suffered a horrible defeat and, of course, met a terrible fate at the hands of the Indians. And again, Crawford's another one of those interesting characters, too. It was most likely Crawford's transit and chains that actually laid out Fort Henry in 1774. Not long after that, I believe around July of that year, Sam McCullough, who we associate as the hero in the legend of the first siege of Fort Henry, the Indians caught up with him around the Ohio County airport, and he finally met his end. As we move up towards September when this occurs, it seems like everybody who's concerned with Fort Henry is coming to bad ends. And now finally, in oddly enough, a very appropriate date, on the September 11th, 1782, again, Wheeling's own 9/11, a young man, probably no more than 16, 17 years old, was probably about 20 miles deep into Ohio on a scout. Typically what they would do, they would send scouts out, and they would send them out for what they referred to as a fortnight, which was 2 weeks. What they would do, they would stay out, and they either would sit astride a particular Indian trail, or maybe they would give them a piece of ground to patrol, like maybe from Rush Run up to a point near Steubenville. They would patrol that for 2 weeks, just like a beat cop would. Okay, you'd be out there, you'd be looking for Indian sign. If you saw something worth seeing, you'd rush back to the fort. This young man is probably about noon, 2 in the afternoon. What he sees about pops his eyes out. There is a huge force of Rangers and Indians headed their way, and they're moving probably at a trot. Typically, that's how they would, the folks who studied the Indians and the Rangers, typically that's how they would move when they were moving in a hurry. They moved at a trot and they covered ground quickly. He sees this, and he's off like a gunshot back toward Fort Henry. As soon as he gets to the river, he fires his rifle, which in turn, when the people inside the fort see that, they realize something is coming. Someone fires the signal gun, and again, when I mean a signal gun, they had a small cannon inside the fort. It was what they referred to as a swivel gun. For a frame of reference, it might have been maybe not quite as long as my arm and about the size of that, and fired probably about 1.5 inch, 2 inch bore, depending on the particular weapon. It wasn't a very big piece of artillery by any standards, but again, it was something and it was here. They fired the swivel gun, and with that, anyone that was here knew they had to get moving. They either had to get into the fort, they had to get moving to wherever they were going to go. And again, this was such a large force that was there that typically a family fort would have not have stood up. This was a large force that was sent out particularly to take Fort Henry. The Indians and the British Rangers, and again, the force was probably about 240 to 260 Indians and about a company of British Rangers. It typically would have been 40 to 60, somewhere there. When they get to the river, they realize they've been made. Unlike the first siege at Fort Henry, there was no attempt at stealth, no attempt at ambush. They very leisurely crossed over to the island. They burned a cabin over there. Then they crossed probably right around the north end of the island. I believe that was a fording place. They crossed the Ohio River there. And again, keep in mind the Ohio River was much shallower then, all right? Now it's like a series of lakes thanks to the Corps of Engineers. But back then it was much shallower, it moved a lot faster. In September around here is the dry season, that's the low water season. It would have been no real big deal for them to ford it at a good fording place. Anyway, it's probably 4 or 5 in the evening. They are crossing the river, and they very leisurely take their time. Once they get on the other side, they begin shooting, maybe burning a few things, killing some livestock. They begin what they call the fire of joy, just to let everyone know they're there. It's just kind of a celebration. And again, aside from being a celebration, it's psychological warfare. It's here, we have you, you're not getting away, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're going to negotiate with us. Well, again, the word negotiation is the next thing that's going to come to the fore here. What they do is they send someone with a white flag. And again, this is odd for a no quarters warfare. It was almost something out of European siege mentality. They send an officer up with a flag to demand the surrender of the fort. Well, he goes up and gives them a rather stilted speech, something to the effect of, we, in the name of the Governor General of Canada, we offer you good quarters and clemency and things like that. The people behind those walls they had no illusions about their fate. When the Indians breached the walls at places like St. Martin's and Ruddle stations and places like that, they killed near everyone that was in there. In fact, they were so blind with bloodlust, they killed enough cattle to have made a lot of them wealthy. These people knew what was waiting for them if the Indians breached the walls. If their courage was about to waver, and again, it probably was, because inside that fort there were probably no more than 20 fighting men, and the rest they probably numbered about 100 people, the rest were women and children. And again, here they are against roughly 300 of what we would think of today in military terms as light infantry, special forces, things like that. Rangers. They were, again, what was arrayed against them. The odds were certainly not stacked in their favor, although it turns out they had some things working for them. But anyway, when they demanded surrender, before they could their courage had a chance to waver, Jonathan Zane stepped up and delivered them a fire-eating speech. He turned around and looked at him and said something to the effect of, we couple your king's name with blackest infamy. Is this your great and Christian king who murders his subject red-handed? Anyway, he proceeded to give them a blistering speech. And about that time, he looked up and gave him a nod, and the cannon was fired at him. Well, this brought home a very unpleasant reality to the Indians. One of the things that the Indians very much had an aversion to was artillery. They didn't like it. They were not exposed to it, and it was something that was out of their everyday experience. They didn't like to deal with it. They went down when they heard that, and it was for lack of a better way to put it, was a very cruel trick played on them. The year prior to that, 1781, they had what was called the aborted siege. And what had happened, the Indians, about the same time in September, they surrounded Fort Henry. Some kids and a young warrior accidentally tripped the raid prematurely. They come to the fort. When they get around it, of course the fort's ready, it's buttoned up for them, they're not getting inside. And they look and they see what appears to be a cannon in the fort. Well, it's not a cannon, it's a black log. When they see the cannon, what they think is a cannon, they back off. So now here they are in 1782 and they're laughing like, show us your cannon. Boom, there it is. Yes, it's a cannon. Again, it's a small artillery piece, but again, it's kind of the idea in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man's king. It's something else to make them keep their heads down. In what they would call it modern-day parlance, a force multiplier. And that's exactly what will happen with the women and children who are in the fort. They will become a force multiplier. How do they do that? Well, again, remember the weapons that they use at that time, you have to fire once, and of course it's a very laborious process to reload these things. When you have someone there that could fire a weapon, and someone's handing them a fresh one, and they're firing another one man has the effect of 3 or 4 as long as he has fresh weapons to fire. And that's just what happens there when they try to rush the fort the first time. What made their defensive situation even better was the fact that they had for lack of a better way to put it, outposts. To the north of Fort Henry, about where the suspension bridge is, there was a, quote, how would I say it, blacksmith slash gunsmith shop. It was owned by a man, you see various spellings called Rieger or Reagan, whatever. He attached a small blockhouse to it, and he decided that he and his sons would try to defend that to the last. And then to the south is Ebenezer Zane's blockhouse. And again, to put this in perspective for you, where Fort Henry would have actually been, if you folks have been to downtown Wheeling, where the historical marker is would just about correspond to the southeast corner of Fort Henry. It was just about as wide as the lot where Guerrero's is. It would have gone north to just about where the Capitol Music Hall is. That's a pretty good indicator of about where it was. We sat down and calculated it mathematically from the historical references we had, and then several years ago, just to make sure when we didn't have anything better to do, we shot it off with a police traffic laser. But anyway, they, in the interest of science. Anyway, when they try to rush the fort, it's very impractical. They're taking fire not only from the fort, but they're taking fire from both sides. And again, one of the hallmarks of Indian warfare is they don't fight like conventional Western troops. They're not going to take needless casualties. There's not too many of them. They're going to do things in the most sensible and economical way they can do it. Sizing up their situation, they quickly realized that the key to taking the fort is to take the outposts. Shortly after dark, they swing to the north, and they actually put a heavy fire on the northern blockhouse, and so much so that these people were actually forced to retreat. They run and get into the North Sallyport and manage to get in. The problem is this thing begins to fill up with British and Indian Rangers, and they're pouring so much fire at the fort that it's really beginning to tell. Most of where the shooting is coming from is the bastions, the blockhouses at each corner. In fact, Betty Zane is in one of these with her brother Jonathan. Excuse me. And they, by Betty Zane's own account, the bullets are not necessarily hitting them, but they're creating so many secondary missiles where it's chipping off the wood and the dust and things like that that it's beginning to cut them up severely. The only way they can make that stop, they had to turn that small swivel gun on that blockhouse and bring it down. So as the battle goes, they said, I think Ebenezer Zane said they rushed the pickets a couple of times that night. Anyway, if you've ever been in a tense situation like that, what you find out is once that adrenaline rush wears off, you're ready to fall to nothing. I mean, you are spent. And that's what's happening to these men on the walls at the Fort Henry. So the women step up and take their places, basically with the idea of saying, rest, we need you fresh. We'll more or less call you if we need you, if they come hard against the walls again. And again, I mentioned the walls. Very important thing to remember about Fort Henry. All the Indians really have to do is get flame to those walls. Fort Henry by this time is 8 years old. It's made of dry logs. And what happens when you put any kind of fire to dry logs? And again, remember this is going on during September, which we all know, I'm sure it was true then too, it's the very driest month of the year. All they have to do is get fire to those things and they're going to go up like that. In fact, they were probably lucky they didn't burn Fort Henry down by accident. I believe there was a small family fort up around Weirton. They actually did that. They burned it down by accident. They didn't need the Indians. An interesting aside, I think it was in 1999, the reenactor Indians succeeded in doing what the real ones did not. The settlers were only saved by the Wheeling Fire Department at Fort Henry days that year. But again, continuing on, they, when the Indians sized this up, the next thing they decided to do, they'd come around the back of Fort Henry. And again, Fort Henry's in a great defensive position there because really the long wall against the river didn't really need to be defended, if so, very lightly. Said the ground was too steep, it would be very hard to attack. And of course, the south wall was almost the same way. What people don't realize, when you go into Wheeling and you go down Main Street, the railing that drops down, that actually sat on a mound, and that eventually, when those times were over, the top of that hill was taken off and dumped there to make Main Street go where it does. That's why 11th Street doglegs down the way it does too. The south wall was almost a sheer drop off there as well. But again, a very defensible position. About midnight, but again, Fort Henry was so old, the southwest bastion had actually fallen in. It was just replaced by pickets. The Indians had found there was a ravine by the river. They had actually begun creeping up, and they actually got against the walls and were starting to put fire to it. A woman spotted them, and what they did, they fired a couple of shots at them and were unable to get at them. Again, they're in a ravine. They've got up next to this. Direct fire weapons, meaning things like rifles, cannot get them because they're in a ditch. What these rather quick-thinking women did, they pulled up hearthstones from the walls, or the cabins on the back wall, and began to use them like mortars and drove the Indians off. Neat stuff, huh? And that was the next crisis that was averted. About 8 o'clock the next morning, they found out from the concussion of the cannon they'd actually knocked down 2 of their own pickets on the north wall. Fortunately, they were hidden by a peach tree, and they managed to make repairs before the Indians and the Rangers could find that. Again, if they had found that with the weapons of the time, they could have never held a determined rush off. So now, about noon of the second day, we come to the real emotional zenith of the battle. They're out of gunpowder. And the first question is, why are they out of gunpowder? Well, typically, an Indian raid only lasted a day or so. But again, what threw things in a bit of a cocked hat for the frontiersmen was the fact that the presence of British Rangers. With the British Rangers, they were going to be a much more determined and longer staying enemy. And the other thing that worked against them there was the fact that they had a cannon. The cannon again acted like a force multiplier. It kept the Indians and the Rangers at bay, but it had a much lustier appetite for gunpowder than a rifle would. Well, the first thing you would say, well, why did they keep more gunpowder in the fort? The simple answer is theft. Gunpowder was very expensive, and if it was kept there, someone was going to steal it. If you happened to be a poor sort on the frontier, it was your turn to pull guard duty. You're looking around, you're probably going to fill your horn before you go home. And maybe you help yourself to a little bar lead too, if there's any around. About a couple of months earlier, Ebenezer Zane had sent to General Irvin for the gunpowder. He basically asked for 40 pounds, and he swore up and down, he said, whatever I take will be burned at the enemy, and he meant it. They kept just enough in the fort to meet an emergency. The rest he kept over in his blockhouse. Well, again, we come to the emotional zenith of the battle. They're out of gunpowder, and they asked for a volunteer. They realize there's more, but it's about 60 yards away. And again, what they're basically running from about where the old shops would have been, the Mendel's, I can't think of the name of them, the children's shops over there. Basically, they're running from that marker over to the old, maybe just a little bit south of where Horns would have been in Wheeling. Again, historically, it measures out from the accounts. It's about 60 yards. Well, anyway, they asked for a volunteer, and even before anyone could say anything, a 16-year-old Betty Zane steps up and said, I'll go, with something to the effect of, if I fall, I'll be less missed than a man. The other side of that is if she falls, it's one of those cases where the living might envy the dead because bad things are going to happen if she fails. She divests herself of shoes and anything else she doesn't think she needs to be wearing and makes the run to the cabin. Now, curiously enough, not a shot's fired when she does. The Indians and the Rangers are all looking at her. They scream, squaw, squaw! But not a shot's fired. She goes into the cabin, tells her brother Ebenezer what the problem is, and of course they quickly decide they have to get gunpowder back to them. So what they did, rather than give her a keg to carry back or something like that, again, you remember a wooden keg, that's a lot of dead weight. This girl wants to be moving hard and fast, and you don't want anything slowing her down. Anything she carried, you want it to be all muscle and no fat there. They take an apron, tie it around her waist, fill it with as much gunpowder as they think she can reasonably carry it. Again, it didn't have to be a lot when you think about it. 10 pounds would have been a lot of gunpowder in that time, but they may have given her as much as 20. I'm sure she didn't want to make that trip more than once. So she steps out, and this time when they tie the tablecloth around her so she's not impeding when she runs, She gets a couple steps out the door, and this time, no one knows exactly how or why that the Indians and the British Rangers divined her mission, but all hell literally breaks loose. She's probably running across there under the sights of maybe as many as a couple of hundred rifles and muskets, and they're firing at her, and it's just one ragged sort of continuous volley, and by her own account, it said the bullets came so close they landed like hailstones around her and cut her clothing, but miraculously she makes it back to the fort. When she when she gets back, of course, I'm sure that buoyed everybody's spirits a great deal. And by the same token, it probably took some of the fight out of the enemy. The fight continues on, and it was at probably toward the evening of the second day. This business of a cannon has galled the Indians mightily. And what they do is they try to make a cannon. Well, first off, why would they do that? Early on in the battle, when the Indians had tried to take the fort the first time, there was a small boat coming down from Fort Pitt. When they saw the battle going on, they thought they'd better get out of it. They stopped at the back. They stopped at the back on the back gate of Fort Henry and managed to run in. What that boat was carrying was a load of cannonballs for George Rogers Clark. The Indians looked at it. They got a couple of cannonballs. They found some chains in the blacksmith shop that they had taken. They wrapped it around a log with the idea. They only needed to fire this thing once, and they tried to. Of course, it exploded, and one doesn't know how many of them it killed or injured, but it certainly would have done damage to somebody. These things don't last. Then by the late in the hours of the second day, probably coming on the morning, maybe you're thinking 3, 4 in the morning, they realized they're going to take one last time, and they're going to take the southern blockhouse. They're going to take Zane's. By then, everybody's again played out. This battle's been going on almost a couple of days now, or actually better than a couple of days. A lot of these people were sitting there asleep, but again, someone's standing watch, and this time it's Ebenezer Zane's slave by the name of Daddy Sam. Daddy Sam standing there with a musket, and again he sees 2 Indians come up, and said one of them had a firebrand, basically this thing smoking with the idea. He whirls it around on a string or a small piece of rope or leather, whatever. As soon as it bursts into flame, it's going into the cabin. And again, all this thing has to do is catch fire, catch these logs fire, and it's gone. It's history, and so are the people in it. Daddy Sam is standing there, sees him, brings his musket up and fires. Now again, imagine, he's probably only firing to distance, maybe from me to this gentleman right there. It's not very far, but it's pitch black. He's firing a musket. When that thing goes off, you get that big puff of smoke. It's already dark. He can't really see whether he's hit his man or not, but he hears a scream, and more importantly, he sees the firebrand laying there on the outside of the cabin. The Indians move off again, and finally, by the morning of the third day, they look around and they're beginning to break up. As the sun begins to come up a little more and a little more, the Indians begin to break up into smaller parties to go out and raid. Just to seek softer targets. Not too long after that, they see another group of people look like they're coming down the hill. And again, it's probably the case of their spirits went down even further. They looked at these people and then they realized they were not British Rangers. They were militia. They were people who actually were coming from what we would think of today as Washington, Pennsylvania, to come to their rescue. And with that, the second siege of Fort Henry is over. And again, according to legend, near the end of the battle, one of the Indians turned around when they got across the river, sort of a sign of universal contempt. He bent over and raised his breech clout and showed his backside to the enemy, a la like the movie Braveheart. Again, a sign of contempt. Supposedly, Ebenezer Zane decided to waste one last bullet, and he drilled him squarely where he was showing. I guess it shows the Zanes always get their men in the end, and sometimes it doesn't matter which one. Anyway, I guess the next question is, why is that battle important? In terms of a military sense, it's somewhat important, again, because the peace negotiations were going on, and there was some back and forth whether the boundary of the newly found United States was going to be on the Mississippi or whether it was going to be on the Ohio. This defeat helped ensure it was going to be further west. More importantly, this was one of the defining moments of the Western theater of the American Revolution. And again, to put this into context, if I ask you what you think about the Old West, most of you folks are going to think of the Alamo, Custer's Last Stand, and Tombstone. Okay, these were three signal events. They were things that you associate with the period. This siege at Fort Henry was one of those things that, when you think of the winning of the eastern frontier, was one of those seminal events that just stay with you. And of course, years afterward, Betty Zane was famous in her own lifetime. 1802, the Scioto Gazette, about 20 years after the fact, publishes a piece, and she is regionally famous. And again, about 1879, this wave of centennial histories begins to come off. And again, there's a very much of an uptick in interest in what these folks had been doing at that time. And then finally, of course, 1903, Zane Grey publishes his very first work, Betty Zane. And with that Betty Zane, for lack of a better way to put it, probably about the 1920s and the 1930s, in the terms of the pantheon of American myth, she probably stood just under Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. And that's why the Second Siege of Fort Henry was so important to, again, our national understanding of who we are and what we are. If someone killed the lights there for us, I have a neat little video here that was done with shooters, was shot up at Fort Henry Day some years ago that I think will give you the look and the feel of what happened there.
Damn horns played out. You got any more? Enough to prime, that's all. All right, let's see if there's any to be had.
Brother, there's not a horn here in 10 with enough powder to even load a musket. We've not enough for even another volley.
Why the hell wasn't more powder left at the fort?
Because y'all thieving hilljacks would have carried it off. Horn at a time. Now, there's plenty more out at the blockhouse. Now I'm wondering, fighting men of Fort Henry, I wonder if there's a hero amongst you, courage enough to go and fetch it.
I will. Should I fall? I'll be less missed than a man.
That was a teaser for both a movie and a documentary, by the way. Either case, I think by the looks on your faces, it stirred sufficient interest.
Sir, do you know how big the fort was? I mean, is this a big facility that a lot of people could be in, or is it cramped?
It was a fairly decent sized facility. There were about 4 different estimates of the size of Fort Henry. Probably the worst one was done in like '76, where a couple of guys were digging around. I think it was Klein and Cooper. I can't remember, but they estimated this thing was about the size of a good sized barn. That's not happening. The one we have that from someone that was actually there was Lydia Boggs Shepherd. Okay, and again, she was actually an inmate in the fort at the second siege. She would have been about 16, 17 years old at the time. She said that the fort was something like, 240 by 300 is what comes to mind. However, her figures are at odds. She said it occupied 3/4 of an acre of ground, okay? When we started calculating that came to about 1.25 acres. What we did, when you look at the topography of the land, and again, I've probably done as much research and looking at this as anybody that I know of, all right? When you look at what they described, another account was about 1/2 acre, all right? When you look at the land where it lays, and again, if this were a murder scene, all right, we don't know where the body is. However, we know where one leg was, all right? We know definitely where Zane's blockhouse was. Through the other things and little extrapolation, we can come to a pretty good understanding of where it was. Then actually, in the Draper manuscripts, Lydia Boggs Shepherd drew a diagram that gave us an idea where things were in the fort. That's the only actual diagram that was. And again, it's just the fact that thing was built in a rectangle, okay, as opposed to a star, all right? And for instance, when you look at Fort Steuben, you see angled bastions on it. That's the mark of professional military engineers. This thing was built by militia, all right? Again, 1774, it's named Fort Fincastle after one of the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. One of his titles was Viscount of Fincastle, and there were a couple other little forts down the road that had Fort Gower, various other titles that he had. That was the common theme there. Again, 1775, he's kicked out, and the new revolutionary governor of Virginia comes in, Patrick Henry. That's where the name comes from. The British military, when they built things, left very detailed diagrams and drawings and things like that. For instance, like Fort Ligonier, they know exactly what it looked like. Fort Henry didn't, because again, the difference. They was built under the direction of Crawford, all right? Crawford was a surveyor. He also had overseen things like the building of grist mills and sawmills and things like that for George Washington, all right? He knew how to build things, but again, he built what he knew. One last thing, we were talking about how this was a women's battle. I forgot to relate that in the very early goings-on was a very neat thing. There, again, it's psychological warfare. Supposedly one of the Gerties was outside the fort and began to taunt inside the fort. He yelled inside, "Have you any, like any other men in combat," he said, "do you have any women or whiskey in the fort?" And a rather tart, and again, just to play on their minds a little bit. And Bessie Wheat stepped up and said, "Yes, but we serve it up hot because we melted our ladles down into bullets." And he replied something to the effect that must have irritated and said the Indians were around there. They didn't say anything, but they were hooting and hollering almost like a rowdy crowd would at a concert or something. When and he said something again, I'm sure he was intimating that their acquaintance would be a little more intimate come morning. And he said, "I'll either be in the fort or hell by breakfast." And she replied back, "Then hell shall be your portion." Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I compliment you folks on the fine historical society you have here. It pleases me so much to see you folks take an interest in this. Anyway, I salute you for that, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you.